Petty Officer Second Class Ellie Harris was just the cook at Forward Operating Base Vanguard, or at least that's what everyone thought. At 27 years old, with sandy blonde hair usually tied back in a practical ponytail and bright hazel eyes that noticed everything, she had spent 4 years learning to feed troops in the most austere environments imaginable. Her hands could prepare meals for 200 soldiers as easily as they could field strip an M4 carbine. She deployed twice to combat zones where her job was to maintain morale through quality food service, and she was exceptional at it. What her fellow sailors didn't know, what even her command didn't fully understand, was that Ellie had grown up in rural Montana with a father who'd been a Marine Corps sniper instructor, learning to shoot before she could drive and hunting elk. In terrain that made military training look easy, Ellie had been serving as the lead culinary specialist at the base for 4 months, managing food service operations that kept more than 300 military personnel fed and mission-ready. Her day started at 0400 hours preparing breakfast for soldiers and sailors, who would spend their day conducting dangerous missions. She managed inventory, supervised junior culinary specialists, coordinated with supply chains that operated across thousands of miles, and somehow maintained food quality standards that would have challenged restaurants in peaceful cities. But despite the critical nature of her work, despite the fact that hungry troops are ineffective troops, as every military leader knew, she was viewed by most personnel as just the cook, the combat arms personnel who conducted missions outside. The Wire saw food service as support rather than combat capability, and the Special Operations Forces who operated from the base rarely interacted with culinary staff beyond eating the meals they prepared. Even her own command chain, while appreciating her professional competence, didn't see her as anything beyond her job description. Chief Petty Officer Marcus Johnson, the senior enlisted SEAL at the base, exemplified this attitude when he approached her one afternoon as she served lunch in the dining facility. The chicken that day had been particularly well prepared. He complimented her with genuine appreciation, telling her she had real talent in the kitchen and suggesting she could probably run a restaurant somewhere after the Navy. Ellie had smiled politely and thanked him, even though she recognized the condescension in his words. He would never compliment a fellow SEAL on having real talent at basic job requirements. To Johnson and most others on the base, purpose. What they didn't know was that Ellie had more trigger time than half the combat personnel on the base. Her father, retired Marine Corps Gunnery Sergeant William Boole Harris, had spent 20 years as a scout sniper instructor at Marine Corps Base Quantico, and he'd taught his daughter everything he knew. From the time Ellie was 8 years old, her father had taught her marksmanship, fieldcraft, land navigation, and tactical movement through the rugged Montana wilderness that surrounded their home. By the time she was 16, Ellie could hit targets at 800 meters with her father's hunting rifle, track elk through mountain wilderness for days at a time, and move through forests so quietly that deer didn't detect her presence until she was within arm's reach. And the lessons she'd learned there were far more challenging than anything the military could teach in a controlled training environment. When she enlisted in the Navy at Adian, Ellie had scored expert marksman on every weapons qualification, completed advanced combat training that most culinary specialists never attempted, and volunteered for every tactical exercise that would accept support personnel. But none of that mattered to the personnel at FOB Vanguard, who saw her job title and made assumptions about her capabilities. She had chosen culinary specialist specifically because it allowed her to deploy to combat zones while avoiding the gender-based scrutiny that female personnel in combat roles often faced. She'd watched female Marines and soldiers fight twice as hard for half as much recognition, endure constant questioning of their capabilities, and deal with assumptions that they were less capable than their male counterparts. By choosing a support rating, Ellie avoided those battles while still deploying to the environments where she wanted to serve. But it also meant that when her capabilities were desperately needed, nobody would believe she possessed them. Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell, the officer in charge of base support operations, personnel file and recognized that something didn't quite add up. During a routine evaluation meeting, Ellie had given her standard answer about wanting to serve and being good at cooking, about troops needing to eat and her ability to keep them well-fed and mission-ready. Mitchell had pressed a bit, noting that Ellie could have qualified for other ratings, potentially even special operations support roles. But Ellie had deflected by saying every rating was important and she was serving where the Navy needed her. What she didn't say, what she couldn't say without sounding arrogant or difficult, was that she'd made a deliberate choice to avoid the constant scrutiny and skepticism that would have come with pursuing a combat-focused career as a woman in the military. That moment came on a Tuesday morning in October during what should have been a routine patrol by a Navy SEAL team operating from FOB Vanguard. Ellie was in the kitchen preparing lunch, supervising 2 junior culinary specialists as they worked on preparing what would feed the entire base that afternoon. When the emergency alert echoed through the compound, the announcement came over the base-wide communication system with the kind of urgency that made everyone stop what they were doing. SEAL Team 7 had been ambushed and captured during patrol operations, with 12 personnel confirmed held at an enemy compound approximately 5 kilometers northwest of the base. The Quick Reaction Force was mobilizing for a rescue operation. The dining facility went completely silent as everyone processed what they'd heard. Enemy forces didn't usually capture American Special Operations personnel. The standard outcome was either the SEALs fought to the death or they were killed immediately. The fact that 12 SEALs had been taken alive meant the tactical situation had been catastrophic, and the enemy had specific plans for their prisoners, none of them good. Ellie continued working mechanically, her hands going through the familiar motions of food preparation, but her mind was already racing through tactical calculations. 5 kilometers northwest would be terrain she'd studied during her morning runs around the base perimeter, part of the physical training regimen she maintained even though it wasn't required for her rating. The enemy compound mentioned in the alert was a fortified position that intelligence had been monitoring for weeks, a known hostile stronghold that everyone had hoped wouldn't become an active problem. As she worked, Ellie listened to the radio. Chatter filtering through the base, hearing the Quick Reaction Force being briefed on the situation. The news got progressively worse with each update. The 12 captured SEALs were being held in a fortified compound defended by approximately 50 enemy fighters, a significant force that would make any rescue attempt extremely dangerous. Intelligence indicated the prisoners would be executed within hours, with the enemy planning to film the executions for propaganda purposes, making an example of American Special Operations Forces to demonstrate their power and demoralize coalition forces throughout the region. The QRF was preparing for an assault, but the coordination required for such a complex operation would take at least 3 hours. Aviation assets were being scrambled from distant locations, supporting units were being briefed, and tactical plans were being developed for an operation that would risk significant casualties to rescue 12 prisoners. 3 hours might be too long. Ellie knew from her father's stories and her own study of military operations that prisoners facing execution were often killed earlier than announced timelines, especially if the captors suspected a rescue attempt was being organized. Every minute of delay increased the chance that those 12 SEALs would be dead before help could arrive. She made a decision in that moment that would define the rest of her career and possibly end her life. She quietly stepped away from the kitchen, went to her quarters, and began preparing for a solo rescue operation that every military doctrine said was impossible. She changed out of her culinary uniform and into combat utilities, the digital camouflage pattern that would help her blend into the terrain she'd be crossing. She strapped on her body armor, the plates heavy but familiar from the tactical training she'd done on her own time. She grabbed her M4 carbine from her weapon locker, the rifle she'd qualified expert with every time she'd been tested, and loaded it with ammunition she'd kept meticulously maintained. She filled her assault pack with supplies she'd need for movement through hostile territory, including water, medical supplies, extra ammunition, and the tools that might be necessary for cutting bonds or breaching doors. She was preparing to do something that would either save 12 lives or end her own, and she was doing it with the same methodical preparation her father had taught her when planning any dangerous operation, Lieutenant Mitchell encountered Ellie as she was leaving her quarters, fully equipped for combat and clearly preparing to go outside the wire. Mitchell's face showed immediate alarm and confusion as she took in the sight of her culinary specialist dressed and armed for a combat mission. She demanded to know what Ellie was doing, pointing out that she wasn't assigned to the quick reaction force. Ellie's response was direct and unapologetic. Those SEALs didn't have 3 hours to wait. The QRF would be too late. She was going to get them out now, before the enemy executed them. Mitchell stared at her in disbelief, her mind struggling to reconcile the image of the cook she supervised with the combat-ready operator standing before her. She tried to reason with Ellie, pointing out that she was a culinary specialist, not a special operations soldier, that she couldn't possibly conduct a solo rescue operation against a fortified enemy compound defended by 50 fighters. Ellie met her eyes with absolute certainty and explained that with respect, she could and she would. Those were their people being held by an enemy that was going to kill them, and someone needed to act immediately. She was the only person who could move right now. Without waiting for the hours of coordination the QRF required, Mitchell tried again, telling Ellie this was insane, that she'd be killed, that even if she somehow reached the compound she couldn't possibly extract 12 prisoners by herself against such overwhelming odds. But Ellie was unmoved. She explained that she'd grown up in Montana hunting elk in terrain worse than this, that her father had been a Marine Corps sniper instructor who taught her fieldcraft before she could drive, that she could move through hostile territory undetected and shoot better than half the combat personnel on the base. She knew that if she didn't try, 12 Americans were going to die within the next few hours. She wasn't asking for permission. She was telling Mitchell what she was going to do. Mitchell recognized the absolute determination in Ellie's eyes and made a command decision that would either vindicate or destroy her own career. Officially, she ordered Ellie to stand down and return to her duties. Unofficially, she handed Ellie a radio and told her to keep her informed of her position, promising to delay reporting her absence as long as possible. As Ellie took the radio, Mitchell's final words were simple and heartfelt. Bring those SEALs home. And bring yourself home too. 30 minutes later, Ellie was moving through hostile territory using the fieldcraft techniques her father had drilled into her since childhood. She moved low and slow, using every terrain feature for concealment, stopping frequently to observe her surroundings with the patient attention to detail that separated professionals from amateurs. Her Montana upbringing had taught her that rushed movement got you killed, whether you were hunting elk or evading enemy forces. Speed meant nothing if you were dead. The 5-kilometer movement to the enemy compound took her 2 full hours, but she arrived completely undetected and in position to conduct detailed reconnaissance of the target. The compound was exactly as intelligence had described, a fortified position with approximately 50 enemy fighters, multiple buildings arranged around a central courtyard, and defensive positions that would make a frontal assault extremely costly in terms of casualties. Through her rifle scope, Ellie could see the 12 captured SEALs bound with rope and being guarded in the central courtyard. They were being held under guard by approximately 20 enemy fighters who surrounded them in a loose perimeter, while the remaining 30 fighters manned defensive positions around the compound's outer walls and approaches. The tactical situation was worse than she'd hoped, but not impossible. The enemy clearly wasn't expecting a rescue attempt, at least not this quickly. They'd positioned their guards to prevent the prisoners from escaping rather than to repel an external assault, and their defensive focus was oriented toward the main approaches that a conventional rescue force would use, the roads and obvious avenues of approach that vehicles and large units would need to employ. Ellie wasn't going to use conventional approaches. She was one person who could move through terrain that vehicles couldn't navigate, using infiltration routes that larger forces couldn't exploit. She keyed her radio to contact Lieutenant Mitchell, keeping her voice low and calm. She reported that she was in position overlooking the target compound and could confirm 12 American prisoners alive and being held in the central courtyard. She gave a quick assessment of approximately 50 enemy fighters total, with 20 guarding the prisoners and 30 manning perimeter defenses. Then she told Mitchell she was executing the rescue plan now. Mitchell's voice came back tense with worry, informing her that the QRF was still 2 hours out and asking if she could wait for support. Ellie's response was negative. She could see enemy fighters preparing what looked like an execution site, setting up cameras and equipment. The prisoners didn't have 2 hours. She was going in alone. Mitchell tried one more time, telling her this was suicide, but Ellie cut her off. This was what she was trained for, even if nobody believed it. Then she signed off and focused entirely on the mission ahead. What happened over the next 90 minutes would become one of the most remarkable solo combat actions in modern military history, though it would be one that nobody would initially believe had been conducted by a Navy culinary specialist. Ellie began her assault by systematically eliminating the enemy fighters manning perimeter defensive positions, using the marksmanship skills her father had spent years teaching her in the terrain, knowledge she'd gained during her careful approach to the compound. Her first shot eliminated a guard in a tower position 300 meters away. The suppressed report from her M4 was quiet enough that nearby guards didn't immediately identify where the shot had come from. The guard simply slumped over, and from that distance it could have looked like he'd fallen asleep or fainted. Her second shot eliminated a guard near the compound's vehicle entrance. The man dropped without a sound, and nearby fighters assumed he'd collapsed from the heat, a not uncommon occurrence in the brutal climate of the region. Ellie moved position after each shot, using the same techniques she'd employed when hunting elk in Montana. Never stay in one place long enough for your prey to identify your location. Always think 3 moves ahead. Constantly use terrain to your advantage and stay invisible. Over the course of 30 patient minutes, she eliminated 8 enemy fighters manning perimeter positions, creating carefully planned gaps in the defensive network that would allow her to approach the compound's central courtyard, where the SEALs were being held. Each shot was carefully considered, aimed at guards whose removal would create the maximum tactical advantage while minimizing the chance of alerting the entire compound to her presence. But eliminating guards quietly from distance was actually the easy part of the operation. The hard part, the part that made this mission nearly impossible, would be reaching 12 bound prisoners, who were surrounded by 20 guards in an open courtyard, and somehow extracting them before the remaining enemy forces could respond and kill everyone. Ellie moved carefully to a new position that overlooked the courtyard where the SEALs were being held. Through her rifle scope, she could see that the prisoners had been bound with rope rather than the metal restraints or zip ties that would have been more secure. The enemy apparently hadn't expected them to remain prisoners long enough to require sophisticated security measures, which gave her an opportunity. She waited with the tactical patience her father had always emphasized, watching the guard patterns and rotations, studying the rhythm of the compound until she understood exactly when and how the guards moved when the guard rotation changed. A moment when guards were moving between positions and attention was naturally divided, as some guards were leaving their posts and others were arriving to replace them. Ellie engaged the guards surrounding the prisoners with rapid precision fire. Her M4 cracked repeatedly as she placed accurate shots on guards standing around the bound prisoners, each shot carefully aimed to avoid hitting any Americans while eliminating the immediate threats. In 15 seconds of sustained accurate fire, she eliminated 6 guards and created enough chaos and confusion that the remaining guards began seeking cover rather than maintaining control of the prisoners. Ellie transmitted on the captured enemy radio she'd taken from one of the guards she'd eliminated during her infiltration, speaking in clear English so the SEALs would understand. She identified herself as friendly forces conducting a rescue operation and instructed SEAL Team 7 to cut their bonds and move to the south wall where she would provide covering fire for their escape. Chief Johnson, the same man who'd complimented her cooking skills just days earlier, didn't recognize her voice in the chaos and stress of the moment, but he recognized opportunity when he saw it. He worked his bound hands free through the loosened ropes, cut the bonds of his fellow SEALs using a piece of sharp metal he found nearby, and led them toward the south wall while Ellie provided covering fire against enemy forces attempting to stop their escape. The enemy compound erupted into complete chaos as approximately 40 remaining fighters tried to prevent 12 escaping prisoners from reaching freedom. They had superior numbers, they were fighting from defensive positions on familiar terrain, and they had every tactical advantage except one. But Ellie Harris had something they didn't have: the ability to shoot accurately under pressure, the tactical patience to wait for clear shots rather than wasting ammunition on suppressive fire, and the motivation that came from knowing that 12 Americans would die if she failed. She engaged enemy fighters who attempted to block the SEALs' escape route, eliminating threats with precision marksmanship while the prisoners fought their way toward the compound's south wall. Chief Johnson and his team reached the wall, climbed, overusing tactical techniques that years of training had made automatic, and found themselves face to face with the person who'd been providing covering fire. Johnson stared at Ellie Harris in complete disbelief, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. The culinary specialist he'd patronized just days earlier stood before him wearing full combat gear, carrying an M4 that showed clear evidence of sustained firing, and calmly scanning for additional threats with the professional composure of an experienced operator. He asked what the hell she was doing here, his voice mixing shock with confusion. Her response was characteristically direct: rescuing him. They needed to move immediately because enemy forces were regrouping for pursuit. Johnson, still processing the impossible situation, stammered that she was a cook, asking how she'd done this. Ellie told him that with respect they could discuss her job title later, but right now they needed to move to the rally point and wait for QRF pickup. She instructed him to follow her, her voice carrying the calm authority of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Ellie led the 12 rescued SEALs through terrain she'd memorized during her approach, using movement techniques her father had taught her and displaying tactical awareness that surprised the special operations personnel who'd spent years training for exactly these situations. Chief Johnson moved beside her as they traveled, still trying to understand what had just happened. He asked where she'd learned to move like this, where she'd learned to shoot like that. She explained about her father being a Marine Corps sniper instructor and growing up hunting in Montana, learning how to move through hostile territory. Before most people learned to drive, Johnson asked the question that was bothering him most. Why the hell was she a culinary specialist if she could shoot and move like a special operations soldier? Her answer was simple and pragmatic: because troops need to eat and she's good at cooking, but that doesn't mean she can't do other things when necessary. The response was so matter-of-fact, so understated given what she'd just accomplished, that Johnson found himself laughing despite the dangerous situation they were still in. They reached the rally point Ellie had identified during her planning, established a defensive perimeter with the SEALs taking up positions based on their training, and waited for the quick reaction force to arrive for extraction. When the QRF helicopters arrived 30 minutes later, they found 13 Navy personnel secured in well-organized defensive positions, 12 rescued SEALs and 1 culinary specialist who'd conducted a solo combat rescue operation that military doctrine explicitly stated was impossible. The QRF commander, Lieutenant Commander Patricia Hayes, approached Ellie with an expression that mixed profound disbelief with growing respect. She'd just received a situation report from Chief Johnson, explaining what had happened, and she needed to confirm the details directly. She asked if it was accurate that Ellie had conducted a solo infiltration of an enemy compound, eliminated multiple guards, freed 12 prisoners, and led them through hostile territory to this rally point. Ellie confirmed that, yes, it was accurate. The SEALs hadn't had time to wait for a coordinated rescue. She'd moved immediately and executed the extraction because it was necessary. Hayes studied her for a long moment, her professional military bearing struggling with the unprecedented nature of what she was hearing. She pointed out that Ellie was a culinary specialist second class, not assigned to special operations, with no authorization to conduct combat operations. What she'd done was completely outside her job description and chain of command. Ellie acknowledged this was true and said she understood. She would accept whatever consequences came from her actions. But 12 Americans were alive who would have been executed if she'd waited for proper Authorization. Hayes looked at Chief Johnson, who nodded confirmation. He told Hayes that Ellie had saved their lives, that they'd been hours away from execution, and the QRF couldn't have reached them in time. She'd moved alone through hostile territory, eliminated enemy guards, freed them from captivity, and led them to safety. What she'd done was extraordinary, regardless of her job title. Hayes made a decision that would affect the rest of Ellie's career. She informed Ellie that she was under investigation for unauthorized combat operations and leaving her assigned duty station without permission, but she was also being recommended for the Navy Cross for extraordinary heroism. Whatever happened, administratively, what she'd done that day had saved 12 lives and prevented a significant propaganda victory for enemy forces. The aftermath of Ellie's rescue operation rippled through not just FAB Vanguard, but the entire Special Operations community and eventually the broader military establishment. The 12 SEALs she'd rescued became her strongest and most vocal advocates, making absolutely clear to anyone who would listen that she'd conducted the operation with tactical proficiency that matched or exceeded what they'd expect from fellow Special Operations personnel. Chief Johnson spoke for the entire rescued team when he testified that Ellie had moved through hostile territory like a ghost, shot like a trained sniper, and executed a solo rescue operation that they specifically taught was tactically impossible. In their training, she wasn't just a cook. She was one of the most capable combat personnel he'd ever worked with, regardless of job title or rating badge, but the administrative response was complicated and politically sensitive. Ellie had violated multiple regulations by leaving her assigned duties without authorization, conducting combat operations outside her job description and without proper clearance, and taking actions that could have resulted in her death and significant embarrassment for the Navy if she'd failed. The fact that she'd succeeded didn't automatically erase the regulatory violations, and the Navy had to decide how to handle a situation that had never occurred before in quite this way. The investigation into her actions lasted 3 weeks and included testimony from dozens of personnel who'd interacted with her during her deployment. Lieutenant Mitchell testified about Ellie's background and capabilities, explaining that she had exceptional skills that extended far beyond her rating. She'd chosen culinary specialist as her job, but her actual capabilities included advanced marksmanship, tactical movement, and combat decision-making that rivaled what Special Operations personnel possessed. When she'd assessed that the captured SEALs would be executed before the QRF could conduct a coordinated rescue, she'd made a tactical decision to act immediately using capabilities that nobody knew she possessed because nobody had bothered to. Look beyond her job title. The investigating officer asked the question that would ultimately define the entire investigation and its implications. Why didn't anyone know about Harris's combat capabilities? Why was someone with advanced tactical skills serving as a culinary specialist without anyone in her chain of command understanding what she could potentially contribute? Mitchell's answer was direct and uncomfortable because the military judged people by their job titles rather than their actual capabilities. Ellie had chosen to serve as a culinary specialist, had performed that job exceptionally well, and nobody had bothered to look beyond her rating to understand what else she could contribute. She'd had to conduct an unauthorized solo rescue operation before anyone recognized that she possessed capabilities far beyond food service, and that failure of recognition had nearly cost 12 lives. The investigation concluded with findings that would create significant changes in how the Navy managed personnel assignments and evaluated individual capabilities. Ellie was officially reprimanded for unauthorized absence from duty and conducting combat operations without proper authorization, a reprimand that would remain in her permanent record and could potentially affect her career advancement. But simultaneously, she was awarded the Navy Cross for extraordinary heroism in combat, becoming one of the very few culinary specialists ever to receive the nation's second highest combat valor decoration. More significantly for her future, she was offered the opportunity to attend screening for Naval Special Warfare training, an invitation extended to very few personnel and almost never to those serving outside combat ratings. Ellie accepted the invitation and became one of the first female personnel to complete the full special warfare training pipeline, eventually serving as a special operations combat medic where her culinary skills, Montana fieldcraft, proven combat capabilities, and surprisingly her experience managing complex food service logistics all combined to make her exceptionally effective in the role. But perhaps the most important outcome of her actions wasn't personal but cultural and institutional. The Navy began comprehensively reviewing how it identified and utilized personnel capabilities that extended beyond narrow job descriptions. Training programs were modified to allow support personnel opportunities to demonstrate tactical skills that might otherwise remain hidden. Evaluation systems were changed to assess broader capabilities rather than just performance within strictly defined job parameters. Years later, when Lieutenant Commander Ellie Harris spoke at the Naval Academy about leadership and capability, she reflected thoughtfully on her experience as a culinary specialist who'd conducted a combat rescue that changed how the military thought about human potential. She explained that when she was serving meals at FOB Vanguard, people saw her job title and made assumptions about what she could contribute. They saw a culinary specialist and thought that defined her entire value to the mission. What they didn't see was her Montana upbringing, her father's extensive training, her marksmanship capabilities, or her tactical skills. When 12 SEALs were captured and facing execution, nobody thought to ask the cook if she could help because they assumed that someone who prepared meals couldn't possibly conduct combat operations. That assumption almost cost 12 lives. The lesson she emphasized to the future naval officers listening to her wasn't that everyone should be able to do everything or that job specialization wasn't important. The lesson was that leaders should never assume they know someone's full capabilities based solely on their job title. Excellence exists in unexpected places. Capability often hides behind assumptions and stereotypes. And the most valuable team members are sometimes the ones everyone underestimated because they didn't look like what people expected. Capability to look like Dot at her retirement ceremony after 20 years of distinguished service. Captain Ellie Harris, who had risen through the ranks and eventually commanded a naval special warfare support unit, offered final reflections on her unlikely journey from cook to combat legend. She emphasized that she didn't stop being a cook when she picked up that rifle to rescue her teammates. She simply showed that being a cook didn't define everything she could do or limit what she could contribute when circumstances demanded it. The real lesson wasn't that everyone should aspire to be a warrior. It was that leaders and organizations should never limit people based on assumptions about what their job title means they can or cannot contribute to the mission, because sometimes, she concluded, the most dangerous person on any base isn't the one with the most impressive job title or the highest rank or the most decorated uniform. Sometimes it's the person everyone called just the cook, who walks into hell alone carrying an M4 carbine and enough determination to bring 12 teammates home alive, proving that capability knows no job description and excellence accepts no limitations based on rating badges or assumptions about what people can do.